Here we go. Allende. Very interesting one. Um, we'll put Allende in C. I think that's a perfect spot for him. Brilliant man, honorable man, inspiring man. Was basically had the elections rigged by the U.S. 2 election cycles in a row before he finally won. Um, had a lot of brilliant ideas about socialism, did everything completely democratically and without violence. I believe he was a doctor. They started Project Cybersyn, which was a very, very forward thinking project to centrally plan the economy with computers rather than pen and paper, to have this computer technology that could do it much faster and more efficiently and make socialism even more efficient as compared to capitalism. And really moving forward the construction of socialism in that sense. However, the reason he's in C, which will be obvious to people who have been watching this channel for a long time, I'm sure a lot of you know this already. Fidel Castro warned him before he was killed by the US backed fascist Augusto Pinochet. He warned him and said, Salvador Allende, there are too many right wing fascist extremists in your country, too many violent members of the military who are going to be bribed by the US to kill you, to overthrow you in a violent coup. The US couldn't beat you by rigging the elections. You were too popular. So now they're going to starve you with sanctions. And Richard Nixon famously said, make the economy scream after Allende was elected. And they're going to dump money and guns into these right wingers who are willing to murder you for power. He warned him and said, you can't be democratic and naive about this. You can't be liberal about this. You have to crack down on these fuckers like Pinochet before the US arms them up and they kill you. Allende didn't listen because he was too moralistic, too nice of a guy, too naive, I guess, in a way, too democratic from the perspective of liberal bourgeois democracy. And that was ultimately his undoing, which is a tragic story. And, Pinochet and the CIA, damn them to hell for doing that to him. But from the communist perspective, you got to know that that's what the CIA does, right? And you have to take steps to combat it. Bishop was assassinated in a CIA coup. Thank you, Chima Madu, for the $2 and for clearing that up. I knew it ended really tragically, but he fought them off for a while. Very based. So many similar cases. Yes, many such cases. Many such cases. All right, let's see here. Hugo Chavez, populism. A. Hugo Chavez is A. He would be S if he was a Marxist Leninist, but is a very populist leader, came from the military, um, invented Bolivarian socialism, or was one of the people who invented Bolivarian socialism, which is basically socialism with Venezuelan characteristics applied to Venezuela's characteristics. Helped build up the commune system, which he saw as like the building blocks of socialism, developing these agricultural communes. He funded them and gave them all these resources through the state. He was constantly pushing for more collectivism, more socialism, rooting capitalism out of every aspect of Venezuelan society. And the U.S. absolutely killed him with a heart attack gun. One of the nurses who was working with Chavez was supposed to be investigated by the Venezuelan government for, possibly poisoning him. And she ended up taking exile in the U.S., where she's being protected from the Venezuelan government from any kind of investigation. Most people in Venezuela think that he was killed, or most of the left wingers, actually. Anyways, so I believe it. Russia said they found evidence of it when they seized the Ukrainian biolab. They found evidence that the U.S. had poisoned Chavez. Wouldn't surprise me at all. So he was hella based. Hella based. Love that guy. One of my biggest inspirations. Ceausescu. Look at him. I don't know much about Ceausescu. I just know he has like a bunch of funny ass portraits. Tito. We will put Tito in B because he was based. He was wrong in all of his debates with the Soviets. Market socialism is what ultimately allowed Yugoslavia in many ways to be dissolved, or their version of market socialism. They're taking IMF and World Bank loans and being more open without, putting harsh enough controls on the markets that they had. the way China has done. And China's learned a lot from the failure of Yugoslavia, the ultimate balkanization of Yugoslavia. But, you know, there's a saying today in Yugoslavia that if Tito was still around, this would work. If like a light bulb isn't working or some, you know, the electricity isn't working, they say if Tito was still around, this would work because things just ran more efficiently because they had socialism. And their market socialist firms were actually competing with the U.S. firms on global markets, which is largely why the U.S. launched the bombing campaign of Serbia, which maintained a lot of the Yugoslavian socialist aspects of their economy. But yeah, I don't know. The guy was pretty based. I don't know what to say. He had his debates with the USSR and China, and I agree with not him, but he was based. So, and he united a country of a bunch of different ethnic groups and nationalities. And eventually, the U.S. was able to sow racial and nationalistic hatred among those groups and get them to fight each other and tear the country apart. So the fact that he was able to unite all those groups, the Albanians and the Bosnians and the Serbs, under one flag, under one state, under one collective society is honorable in and of itself. And this goes back to what Haas is always saying about, you know, how big nations, large nations are often better than smaller nations, which are like balkanized, fascistic, racist states, rather than big collective states that unite vast swaths of people across different cultural lines. The way that unraveled was absolutely terrifying. Absolutely. Yeah, it was. And people like Slavoj Žižek and Vauš are still out here supporting it. They support the NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. And they call themselves leftists. Slavoj Žižek's one of the most influential communists in America. And he supports that shit. Craziness, the situation that we inherited, you guys. Craziness, the situation that people our age inherited in the American left, where we got these well-respected philosophers supporting NATO bombing of a socialist republic. Gosh, we had a lot of work to do when we first joined the left, I tell you what. Still got a lot of work to do. Fidel, you guys want me to piss Carlos off? Hey, Carlos, this is for you. Fidel, A tier. Che Guevara, S tier. And in the future, when people are doing communist leader tier lists like 100 years from now, they'll have Carlos in the A tier and me in the S tier. Because everybody loves the rugged adventurer communist like Che more than the statesman like Fidel. I'm just kidding. Fidel was so based, such an amazing human being, dodged so many assassination attempts, was so pragmatic and practical. Called himself a Cuban nationalist during the revolution, but after the revolution said I've been a Marxist-Leninist my entire life. Never faltered with that. Held Cuba together in the 1990s during the special period when the Soviet Union collapsed and was no longer buying their sugar. Somehow held Cuba together through that situation. To this day, I don't know how he was able to do that. It's truly an amazing feat of political organizing. And the more I talk about it, the more he's got to go in A tier. The guy's based as hell. And he fought in the revolution, led the revolution as an actual military leader on the ground doing guerrilla war. So absolute hero. And of course, he vastly increased the standard of life in Cuba, taught everyone to read, built all these new hospitals and homes and schools. So a hero. Che Guevara is my own personal hero. He's my favorite. If I had to rank these ones in S tier, Che would be number one for me in terms of who inspires me the most and how I live my day-to-day life, and who not to say that I'm Che, but who I see the most of myself in and who I relate to the most on a personal level. It's Che far and away. His dedication to sports, even though he had asthma as a kid, reminds me of my own dedication to wrestling, even though I had Lyme disease as a kid, which now we know was a U.S. bioweapon. So I'm a U.S. bioweapons victim, just like Hugo Chavez, I guess. But anyways, the fact that he was led to communism by a desire to help people. He was basically traveling around, helping people as a doctor before he realized that systemic change was the only thing that could actually improve people's material conditions on a mass scale. He couldn't do it as an individual himself. Collective change was needed. I relate to how he thought the U.S. empire was run by a bunch of evil wizards for a while. And then he studied Marxism and realized that the U.S. empire is a capitalist empire, and the imperialism that we see in the modern era is rooted in the system. He understood that Latin America couldn't have true independence without economic independence. He was basically a pan Latin Americanist who wanted to unite all of South America and the socialist unity into one socialist state. And he also ran the country's industry after the revolution, not because he liked doing it, not because he liked planning and doing math and managing the country's heavy industry, but because he was the most well-read, because he had read so much theory and had such a deep understanding of Marxism that he was the only one who could do it really well. And he did that job diligently, even though he hated it, even until he went to go fight more revolutions in the Congo and Bolivia, where he died, which is my only critique of him. It was kind of stupid to go to Bolivia, even though it's badass and honorable that he was going to other Latin American countries and even another continent to fight for their people. The same way he was Argentinian and he went to Cuba to fight for their people and was embraced by them. Also badass. I mean, this was a guy who was setting up schools, Marxism schools, to teach the peasants to read and to teach them Marxism during the revolution, while the guerrilla war was still ongoing. So that shows how important theory was to him and how important a Marxist-Leninist basis for your thinking was to him, that he was using resources during a guerrilla war to educate people. And it worked, and it's part of the reason why Cuba has been so difficult for the U.S. empire to overthrow to this day, because their people are so educated. All right, sorry. I could talk about fucking Che forever, dude. This guy is such a badass. When I read his biography, I loved the man already, right? But I was expecting to come away with a more critical view of him and you know, the more bad things that he did. That biography is 700 pages, and by the time I finished it, I was like, this man is a god or a demigod. This man is the closest thing like Marxists have to a literal superhero in real life. I couldn't believe how many of the amazing stories I had heard about Che were true, and how few of the bad things I had heard about him were true, and how his mistakes were just genuine mistakes that he learned from. Truly a heroic man. And, you know, just reading about what he would do physically, his training for the revolution, what he would do mentally, how he would, you know, run around the Escambray Mountains with a weighted backpack and then come back and read Marxist theory and encourage others to do it and criticize his friends, right? Not like a liberal who hides their criticisms in order to make people like them, like a Trotsky, which is something that Mao rails against in combat liberalism. Che would chastise the people around him if they weren't doing the right things. He never even he had a couple wives and I think a mistress during the revolution. But after the revolution, when they took power, he never cheated on his wife. They would offer him like women when he would go abroad to other countries on diplomatic visits, and he would reject them and send them away when I'm sure other people would partake. So really heroic guy. When it comes to like morality and virtues, I know Marxism isn't about morals. You can have whatever moral compass you want for the most part and still be a Marxist as long as you'll fight for the working class. You don't need to be a great person. But in terms of my own personal moral, ethical worldview, I align like 100% with Che Guevara because he turned Marxism into like a worldview. He was big on not just needing to destroy capitalism as a system, but also the culture and the individualism and selfishness that capitalism imposes upon us and indoctrinates us with, to fight that in our own actions and to act as collectivists, and to act not in our own benefit, but in the benefit of the whole of society and the community and our comrades. And this is why Fidel Castro called him a man from the future. He was a communist man living in a semi-feudal capitalist society. He was ahead of his time. He was more collectivist. He thought like a communist, not like a selfish, individualistic opportunist. And he was hated by a lot of the academic Marxists in Cuba at the time, in Havana, because he was too revolutionary and too based. And he proved them wrong by leading a successful revolution while they were sitting in their ivory tower doing not shit. But anyways, that's enough about Che. I'm sorry. I love that man so much. He has affected my life so positively, in such a deep way. Easy for me to talk about him forever. Huey Newton, I'm not going to rank him because I have a biased perspective on him as an American. His theory of the lumpen proletariat is interesting. I don't know if I agree with it. It made sense for the Black Panthers' conditions at the time, though. Good leader. You should read about him, and read about what the CIA did to the, Black Panthers, and learn from the mistakes of the Black Panthers as well, because there were mistakes and their leaders acknowledged that. But I'm not going to rank him with like Kim Il-sung and stuff. That just doesn't seem right. Ortega, the former guerrilla and now elected leader of Nicaragua. Ortega, I mean, you almost have to put him in A because he's still leading a socialist state, right? He's still in power. And a lot of these leaders in the B tier, well, not all of them, but a couple of them had socialist states that were overthrown by imperialism. Whereas Nicaragua was once overthrown by imperialism after the revolution, but then 6 years later, I believe it was, they came back and won in an election. And what happened during those 6 years was the Sandinistas had to regroup and re-strategize. And they said, not only are we going to take an electoral path now, a more revolutionary electoral path, not like an AOC electoral path where they just join the Democratic Party and call themselves socialists and get voted in. No, but a real revolutionary electoral path where they had, deep connections especially in the rural regions where the campesinos are. That's where a lot of the strongest support for the revolution is. And a lot of the anti-revolutionary sentiment comes from the universities and the colleges and the libs, the upper classes, the educated professional classes. So that should tell you something about the reactionary nature of those classes, as compared to the rural and industrial proletariat. But anyways, the other direction that they decided to go during that time was in a more Christian direction. There were 3 factions within the Sandinista party, and it was the more Christian faction that won out. And they started doing things like pushing Christian values at the community level and synthesizing the country's Protestant Christian beliefs with socialist political and economic theory. And that has been very successful. And in some ways, they are more socially conservative, which is why, you don't hear like PSL and other American communist parties praising them as openly as they'll praise like a Cuba, because they have socially conservative positions. Like they're not, pro-abortion. They're mostly against, stuff like that and things that a lot of Americans would consider culturally progressive, although you can argue whether they are or they aren't. So they have also faced horrible sanctions from the U.S., which again aren't talked about as much. And I do think this is partially because they're more Christian and more socially conservative, that the embargo on Cuba and the sanctions on Venezuela get talked about far more than the crippling sanctions on Nicaragua that they've done very well in the face of. They have like healthcare facilities in the rural regions, in regions where they would have had to walk 2 days to get healthcare access in the past. So badass socialist experiment. Ortega's a badass socialist leader who cut his teeth in the guerrilla struggle before winning an election, and he's still in power to this day. A little bit eccentric, but a great leader and a great man. Hey, relax, guy. You need a rest. I was just thinking that. I'm like, man, I've been just ranting about these leaders for like an hour and 20 minutes now. I should probably check the chat a little bit. Didn't Huey get psyoped into drugs and adventurism? I've heard that, but I've also heard that that's bullshit. I've heard that before, but I've heard that, that whole narrative about him is actually a psyop in and of itself. So I don't know. It's hard. The sad thing is how the left is hardly revolutionary or even organized. Many aren't even leftists and just pretend. Yeah. We're building, though. We're getting there. We have the American Communist Party now, a real Marxist-Leninist party. And eventually, we'll be in an era where you can't call yourself a communist or a Marxist-Leninist unless you're in the party, where there's one unified Marxist-Leninist party in America. We'll reach that day. We'll reach that day soon. Bukharin should be C tier. He contributed a lot. He did. You're right. But he also collaborated with extremist right-wingers to try and overthrow the government. So I agree, though. He was a smart guy who contributed a lot. I want to see the Gaddafi and Sankara rankings. Are they on here? They better be on here. I mean, I guess they weren't. Gaddafi wasn't communist, but still. Socialist. No, seriously, why is there a book in F? What the hell is Settlers? I explained that earlier if you want to rewind the stream. It's because there was probably a CIA book, because the author, Jay Sakai, probably never existed. And the CIA put that book out there just to weaken the left and confuse young leftists in their education and theoretical development. Hell yeah, ACP. Let's go. Ortega above Enlai? I don't know about that. Yeah, that doesn't really make sense, does it? When you're ranking these people, you know, you just kind of go along and do it. And then when you look at your tier list after you're done, sometimes it's like, well, that one doesn't really make sense. How can Zhao Enlai, a Marxist-Leninist leader, be under, you know, of China, the world's most powerful existing socialist state, be under Ortega? It's just the way I would explain it is Enlai wasn't the main leader of China. He was under Mao. Whereas Ortega is the figurehead of Nicaragua. So that's really the only explanation for that. But yeah, theoretically, and in terms of, you know, agreement and alignment with the ACP, Enlai is probably above Ortega. But that we love the Sandinistas. I don't mean to say like we have all these disagreements with the Sandinistas. We love their Christian socialist system, super based, want to build tighter connections with them. They're one of my favorite existing socialist projects in the world today. B for Gaddafi. Yeah, that's about what I would say too. Let's see here. Malcolm X, not really a communist, based, but not a communist. Martin Luther King, same thing. Deng Xiaoping, for me, Deng is an S tier. For me, Deng is the sixth head of Marxism. I don't see how you can be pro-China today and not put Deng as one of the heads of Marxism and understand that Deng had a huge advancement in Marxist theory, understanding that we can use the animal spirits of capitalism in order to develop socialism. Because what is Marx's analysis? It's that one mode of production evolves out of the other. And China had feudalism. They never had capitalism. Right? So they had to use the forces of the global market, the forces of global capitalism, in order to develop the means of production and develop socialism. And it went a little bit crazy in the 90s with corruption and the markets kind of getting out of control. But then they recalibrated in the 2000s, in the 21st century, under Xi Jinping and the other leaders who did these anti-corruption campaigns, these crackdowns on party corruption and market corruption, and crack down on all these corrupt billionaires and punish them harshly and publicly in front of everybody. And they've lifted more people out of poverty than any other country in human history. They're responsible for 75% of global poverty reduction over the last 10 years. And if it wasn't for Deng Xiaoping, none of that would have been possible. Yes, it was a tactical retreat of sorts, the reform and opening up policy. It was something that China had to do because they were under the boot of imperialism and they saw themselves on the path to collapse like the USSR. But it was a genius move ultimately that worked. And the only way that he could have come up with this strategy or theory is by deeply understanding Marxism. Not understanding Marxism as just this stagnant thing where we need to institute socialism and it needs to look like this. But no, understanding that socialism is something that in many ways develops on its own, not without guidance and without the guidance of the Communist Party. But socialism does evolve out of capitalism. Capitalism creates the conditions for the possibility of socialism. And so the animal spirits and the markets of global capitalism can be harnessed by the party and used to develop socialism. It was only through a deep understanding of Marxism, Leninism that he could come to those conclusions. So he's up there for me. Deng set the standard for reforming communist practice. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. That's a good way to put it. He reformed how existing socialist countries can exist, and in doing so, he revived and helped to give life even to other communist countries like Cuba and Vietnam, who have copied China's model in many ways. The DPRK as well. They also did their own reform and opening up on a smaller scale. So, oh, they do have Kaesong Pham Vane. Let's go. The Laotians getting some praise. He's definitely A, probably over here. Well, without this guy and without the Laos communists, the Vietnam War would not have been winnable by this guy and the Vietnamese communists. The Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through Laos. Laos is a Marxist-Leninist country to this day, very agrarian country. They have all these like isolated rice fields, so they've implemented a lot of new education and healthcare, and they have industrialized, but they're still a very agrarian country, and they have a very unique Laotian style system. They're not this giant, and not, Vietnam's not giant, but Vietnam has big cities, right? They're industrialized, and even before the revolution, that was the case. Very urban, lots of urban centers in Vietnam. Laos is not like that. They have very few urban centers, mostly just rice farmers. But they were bombed more than any other country in human history during the Vietnam War. And this never gets talked about. It never gets talked about. They never say that it was a war against Indochina, or at the time French Indochina, which it was, against Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam. And they never mentioned that Laos was essential to the struggle. Like I said, the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through Laos. Without Laos, there would have been no winning the Vietnam War. Without Laos going in a Marxist-Leninist direction, that would have never happened. And obviously, they were guided every step of the way by the much larger Communist Party of Vietnam. But still, they had their own revolution. Their own people moved towards communism, their own version of communism, their own unique form of Marxism-Leninism applied to their own unique conditions. And they've maintained that system to this day, even through the fall of the USSR, one of their main trade partners. And if you read what this guy wrote about Laos's conditions at the time, the theory and practice that he wrote about in relation to Laos, it's very interesting stuff. So I'm probably one of the only people in the world who knows Kaesong Pham Vane outside of South Asia. But he's awesome. Thank you, Scorpion Sag, for the $10 super chat. Appreciate you, brother. That's huge. Thank you so much to you and all the other super chatters today. If you like Che, I bet you would like Vo Nguyen Yap. I liked his biography, Victory at Any Cost, by Cecil Curry. All right, I'll look it up. I got to write that down, though. The former deputy prime minister of Vietnam? Okay, interesting. Sounds based. I'll check it out. Thank you, comrade, for the super chat and the recommendation. R.I.P. Anthony Bourdain. Yeah. Shout out to Henry Kissinger. Pa, pa. Where are we at here? Jiang Zemin, we can skip him. Krupskaya, Krupskaya was based. We'll rank her. Put her in C. Angela Davis turned the CPUSA liberal. I'm not even going to rank her. Again, it feels wrong even putting her in the same list as a lot of these guys. And she was heroic, back in the day, going to court, standing up against the racist, capitalist, legal system at the time and winning. But her role within the CPUSA was really devastating and harmful. Really helped push the CPUSA towards being an appendage of the Democratic Party, and liberalism, and even, openly advocating for a hyper focus on identity politics and culture war stuff rather than class. So really sad what she ended up becoming. But if imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, then must China pass through imperialism before socialism? Thank you, Jonathan Foster, for the $5. No, that's not what that means. And in fact, China has been developing and is about to surpass the U.S. in development without doing any imperialism, which shows that you can develop and industrialize and bring your people out of poverty without pillaging other countries. That you can have a foreign policy based on mutual development, we scratch your back, you scratch ours, rather than we're going to overthrow your government in a violent coup and pillage all of your resources, right? China's been able to develop without any of that. The US and even the UK needed slavery to industrialize. They were profiting greatly off of that cotton produced by slaves in the American South. They needed all sorts of pillaging and violence to industrialize. And there was always this vast income inequality where the working masses haven't been able to benefit and reap the rewards of imperialist plunder. It's all been funneled to the top. So actually, without imperialism, you can develop much faster. But yeah, funny question. Thank you for being a YouTube member, and thank you for the $5 super chat, comrade. Solidarity. Who do we got here? Zenobia, Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping. I'd say you have to put him in A at this point. Or I mean S. S or A. I mean, the anti-corruption campaigns, the poverty alleviation efforts, deepening these things has really recalibrated China after the Deng era, away from the problems that came that Deng predicted. Deng predicted that using capitalist markets would lead to corruption and more petty bourgeois ideology and more consumerism in China, and the negative things that come with that as well. And Xi Jinping has helped to recalibrate, almost away from capitalism and back towards more socialism, although that's a simplistic way to understand it or explain it. But he has, in a way, cracking down on all the corruption and deepening the party's poverty alleviation efforts, which is a deepening of their control over the economy, their central planning of the economy. He's also taken China forward in their battle against imperialism, their economic battle against imperialism that has not yet become a military battle, but could eventually. So yeah, I put him in S at this point. Jenny gets it. Let's go. Thank you, Chima Madu. Another $2 super chat. Appreciate you for the consistent donations, comrade. Most Americans know Laos through King of the Hill. Is there a King of the Hill episode about Laos? If there is, you're probably right. It's probably how most Americans understand the wonderful, interesting Marxist-Leninist country of Laos. Thank you for the super chat, Chima. Let's see here. Sankara, again, I know a lot of leftists have tainted people's view of Sankara because they're all these liberal leftists put him in their bio because they see him as more of a victim than, say, Stalin, who ran this big, powerful country versus a small African country. But the man was still amazing. The Che of Africa is what they called him, and that's a good explanation. Completely uncorruptible. Sold off all of the government luxury goods when he got in power, launched tree planting campaigns, education campaigns, allowed women to run for office and hold roles in the government, did all these awesome things. So S tier. Well, he was also killed, though. All these leaders up here, see, we got to put him in A tier, though, because none of these leaders up here were killed and overthrown. And ultimately, Sankara should have cracked down upon the scumbag traitors and opportunists around him. And his refusal to do that, his, again, being overly kind of like Allende, is what ultimately led to his downfall. So because of that mistake and the coup of Burkina Faso, backed by Belgium and the US, I believe, we have to put him in A. Good S tier so far. Thank you. Xi is above Deng. I don't know about that. That's a debate. That's how you lose your S. That is how you lose your S. Hopefully Ibrahim Traore learns. He seems to have. He's been cracking down on the scumbags and traitors within his administrations. Ernst Thälmann, we talked about him earlier. Quite based. We'll put him in B. Saeed Barr, that was the guy in Somalia, I believe. Crazy situation where the USSR was opposing him and I think China was backing him, but he was a Marxist-Leninist. I don't know enough about it, but crazy and hyper complex situation that was going on there. Gromsky. We'll go B for Gromsky. His theory of hegemony and the media and stuff like that is quite interesting and good, and set the stage for a lot of future Marxist analysis that added to the theory of Marxism and our understanding of media and propaganda and how liberalism enforces its hegemony. Interesting stuff that opened the door to more interesting stuff. Samora Machel was based, I believe, too. Was he the New Jewel movement, or was that Bishop? He was Mozambique, which was, I don't know if it was the New Jewel. I think the New Jewel might have been Bishop. But they were based too. Mozambique was under him, both in terms of foreign. I believe this is either them or it was either him or Bishop. Probably him. It would have had to been him, because he was in Mozambique, which is Africa. He must have. He was funding the anti-apartheid forces in South Africa. He was funding supporting the liberation movement in South Africa, which is super based, while building socialism in Mozambique and then raising people out of poverty and stuff. And then he died mysteriously in a plane crash, which is one of the CIA's favorite ways to take people out. So I don't know how he could have avoided getting on a plane that crashed. It's pretty tough for small African countries to defend their leaders. But put him in B. George Habash, famous Palestinian Marxist-Leninist, I believe one of the founders of the PFLP, or one of its earliest leaders, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the Marxist-Leninist resistance group, along with the DFLP, which is the Marxist-Leninist Maoist resistance group. The mentor and leader of my favorite Palestinian thinker and resistance fighter of all time, the Marxist-Leninist genius Ghassan Kanafani. So anyone that inspired Kanafani gets ranked well. We'll put him in B as well. Jeremy Corbyn. Mandela gets C for ending apartheid, but then not being able to actually consolidate revolution. And now apartheid still exists economically. He didn't economically erase apartheid. All of the wealth and land in South Africa still belongs to, white people with European roots, the same descendants of the colonizers who benefited and profited from apartheid, if not the same exact people who are still alive today, the ones that are still alive today. So he erased apartheid de facto but not de jure, or de jure but not de facto. I don't know. We should figure that out. One sec. De facto and de jure. De jure is based on laws, and de facto is in fact. Okay, that makes perfect sense based on how the words sound. So he abolished apartheid politically, de jure, but he didn't abolish apartheid de facto in terms of the economy and who actually controls the wealth and the power of South Africa. All right. Saddam. Oh, here we go. Here's some more good ones here at the bottom. Gaddafi, I'll put him in B. Socialist leader. If he was a Marxist-Leninist leader and developed a nuclear weapon, he maybe wouldn't have been overthrown by NATO-backed terrorists and NATO bombs. His book, The Green Book, is a very interesting read. I encourage everyone to read it. It's very short. He explicitly says that socialism is the solution to Libya's economic problems and lays out a plan for how to build socialism in Libya, which was very interesting, giving tools and land directly to farmers and letting them create food for themselves while the government, was funding things like healthcare and more education and things like that. And obviously, there was larger scale food production going on too, but also a lot of the people in the rural regions who were far away from industry were given the means, the tools, the means of production in order to produce their own food, similar to the populations in rural China, which helped lift them out of poverty and make them more self-sufficient and make sure everybody got fed. So very interesting stuff. Not a Marxist-Leninist, and his critiques of Lenin are in the Green Book are interesting. But again, they're ultimately partly what led to his downfall, because he didn't establish a dictatorship of the proletariat, because he allowed for too much decentralization. In the name of decentralization, it made him easier to prey upon and exploit, and it made it easier for Israel and the U.S. to destabilize the country, because they didn't have this strict dictatorship of the proletariat, which understands that it needs to defend the revolution from imperialism. It understood that, but not as explicitly as Lenin, which is why he shouldn't have rejected the DOTP. That being said, very base leader, tragic what the U.S. did to him. Also a Pan-Africanist, which any African socialist should be a Pan-Africanist. Africa's borders were drawn by Western imperialist powers, right? Every socialist in Africa and every prominent socialist in Africa historically has wanted to unite those peoples against empire and get rid of these borders that were drawn by colonial powers. And of course, his idea for making an African developmental bank and getting Africa off of the Western-dominated global financial system is why many people suspect that he was finally killed by the U.S. And that was pushed for under the Obama administration by Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, or Condoleezza Rice, and Samantha Power, the trifecta of evil neoliberal women. Assad, again, not a communist, but a socialist. We'll put Assad in C. Again, Assad should have cracked down on the scumbags and opportunists and lazy bums in the Syrian military who sold him out for money. He should have cracked down. He should have gone into Idlib with the military after they won the war with Russia's help. He allowed these extremist groups to just hang out in Idlib, regroup, get weapons and funding from the U.S. and Israel, I'm sure, and then eventually overthrow his government when Russia was tired of helping. His father, Hafez al-Assad, who I would put maybe one above him, or in the same spot. I don't know. Probably in the same spot. He was probably better, led the revolution / coup in Syria, but they were Ba'athist socialists, not communists. So they didn't do land reform. They tried to unite the Syrian bourgeoisie with the Syrian proletariat against imperialism, rather than resting all of their hope in the proletariat and redistributing the land to them, taking it from the opportunistic pro-imperialist bourgeoisie, or the imperialist that's prone to selling out to, or the bourgeoisie that's prone to selling out to the imperialists. He didn't take away their power and land and give it to the workers, and ultimately that allowed Syria to be destroyed, which was a huge blow for the Palestinian resistance and the axis of resistance against Zionism in that region. Although he gets points for being part of that axis of resistance, for being so based when it comes to Palestine, and for implementing a lot of socialist policies that did help Syria develop, and made people's lives better, and was increasing standard of life in Syria consistently. When there wasn't a fucking insane war going on with a bunch of U.S. and Israeli-backed terrorists running around. By the way, Israel said that ISIS was their strategic ally in Syria openly. So make of that what you will. Nasser, again, not a communist, an Egyptian nationalist. But Nasser was based. He's borderline B. Zhou Enlai should be A. Putting him in A. Gamal Abdel Nasser is like C.5. He's like in between C and B. Great leader, led the struggle against the Zionist entity. This was it's hard to imagine now because all these Arab countries are such sellouts other than Yemen, Lebanon, Syria before Assad was overthrown, and Iran. Iran's not an Arab country, but all these Muslim countries are such sellout countries now, and Egypt is such a cuck of the West. But at the time when Israel was first formed, all of the Arab countries, or the vast majority of them, were united in fighting against it. And Egypt was actually the main protagonist engaging in all of these wars against Israel. They gave Israel its greatest military defeat in 1973, killing 2,000 IDF soldiers and injuring another 7,000, and seizing a bunch of strategic military positions in the Sinai, which forced Israel to give the Sinai back. The only time in history that they've ever ceded land back to the Arabs, which shows that the only way to get land back from Israel is through military force, not through begging them or trying to, sign deals that they're just going to go back on, start killing your people again, which is what they've done every time. So Nasser was super based. He also built the Aswan Dam, which electrified his country and gave like 1 million people power in their homes and electricity. So he had very nationalistic, socialistic economic policies and based foreign policy. He obviously made mistakes. The non-aligned movement was stupid. They should have just sided with the Soviets. Why have a non-aligned movement when it's the Soviets versus the U.S.? Clearly, there's a bad guy in this situation. And you should just side with the Soviets who are willing to back you. Why do you have to be non-aligned and be different? Marxism, Leninism is the way forward. Every time you try to do something different, you end up getting overthrown by the U.S. But anyways, still a base leader. Syria was occupied and sanctioned to the point of crippling them. That's true. The U.S. was also occupying all the oil fields in northern Syria, and they were sanctioned to the point of destruction and had all this USAID money and NED money flowing in to fund the most right-wing, anti-government, extremist, pro-Israel elements. Okay, what else do we got here? Is that it? Not ranking Saddam. Are there any other I want to rank here? I think that's it, folks, for the ones I wanted to rank. So here's our list. Not bad. Not bad. Got Che, Marx, Engels, Lenin, Stalin, Mao, Kim Il-sung, Ho Chi Minh, Castro, Deng, and Xi in S. Got Kason Famvain of Laos, Zhou Enlai of China, Dimitrov of Russia, Haksa of Albania, right? Or is that yeah, right? Yeah, Albania. Haksa of Albania. Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un of the DPRK, Connolly of Ireland, Chavez of Venezuela, Ortega of Nicaragua, Sankara of Burkina Faso, and then all these other leaders. Got these turds at the bottom. There we go. Now our list is complete. Wait a second. There we go. Just kidding. All right, everyone. That was fun. What'd you all think of that? Should we do more tier lists in the future?